Hi viewers, today I'm here with mechanical engineer, activist, and keynote speaker, Yasmin Abdel-Majid. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and chat with me. Question 1. You helped establish Youth Without Borders when you were only 16. What motivated you to be socially responsible at such a young age?
Can I go?
Of course.
Thank you. I was born in Sudan, and my family is like a mix of Sudanese, Egyptian, and a whole bunch of things. But we moved to Australia when I was a year and a half, and I always grew up kind of, with my parents volunteering, and I felt like I had, some sort of responsibility towards the community. It was kind of how we always operated. Other kids went to soccer on Saturdays and we went to, school to volunteer. But when I was about 13, I read this book that kind of changed my life. It was about a girl named Sabrina the Teenage Witch, right? And Sabrina, she thought that nobody was listening to her, right? And she was like, I bet you if I disappeared, nobody would notice. And then she erased herself from existence, but she could see what life was like when she wasn't there. And her aunties had stopped talking to each other because she wasn't there to, make the peace between them. Her best friend had got into all sorts of trouble. And she realized that the people in her life, their lives were different when she wasn't there. And I remember thinking, oh, what would my life be like if I disappeared? And I kind of decided from that point that I wanted to really make sure that everything that I do, it impacts the people around me in some way. And then when I was 16, I attended this conference where there was 100 young people from around the Asia Pacific, and they all talked about the awesome organizations they were a part of, but no one really wanted to work together. And I remember thinking, we're all trying to help the same people, right? We shouldn't be competing for the same bits of funding and that kind of thing. And so I pitched to the group. I was like, why don't we set something up, like an initiative or an organization that's focused on young people leading their own change? And everyone thought I was crazy, but, here we are.
Yeah, I love it. I love that Sabrina the Teenage Witch influenced you and inspired you in such a strong way. Yeah. That's amazing. So in your memoir, Yasmin's Story, Who Do You Think I Am?, you mentioned your grandma saying she was proud of mothering a doctor, 2 architects, 3 engineers, a scientist, and a pharmacist. So a whole lot of success. How much of her positive influence contributed to the many impressive versions of you? Because you're a mechanical engineer, you're an activist, you do it all.
Thank you. I mean, I'm really lucky that I come from a line of strong, women, especially my grandmother being a very strong woman. I mean, it's amazing. She, was the parent of many, many professionals, and she never finished school herself. So it was pretty incredible. I think what she taught me was that no matter where you came from or what kind of background you may have, firstly, the power of education to really to kind of help you go through life and to help with things like social mobility and to kind of, have your eye on some sort of goal and really be able to work for it. But also, I think like an unshakable belief in yourself, right? Like I really think that my grandma was like, the world will be tough, but we're stronger than that. And I think we also had like a strong faith component as well. And she always believed that things were meant to be. And so, you just got to put in the work and things will kind of end up how they should be.
So in your TED Talk, you discuss unconscious bias. Can you explain what unconscious bias is and the steps an organization can take to overcome that?
Yes. So unconscious bias is one of my favorite topics because I think I remember when I kind of discovered it, when I came across it, I was like, oh my God, this explains so many things about kind of how the world works. So the reality is our brains, we get 11 million pieces of information at any given point, right? But we can only process about 40. So our brains make all these shortcuts, right, to make sense of the world around us. And some of those shortcuts are useful, right? Like if you see a red stove, you're like, oh, it's probably hot, I'm not going to touch it, right? That's a shortcut your brain makes. But sometimes those shortcuts are not based on information that's very true. So you might see a woman wearing a hijab or a headscarf and your automatic reaction is like, somebody forced her to wear that, or she might not be very assertive or whatever. But that information is coming from stereotypes and tropes and things that, you may not actually be true. So the concept of unconscious bias is pointing out what are those shortcuts that our brains are making about the people around us, and how do we notice them, and how does that affect our organizations, affect our interactions, and what can we do about them? So are we assuming that someone who's a female isn't necessarily as good a leader, because that tends to happen often? Are we not promoting people because we don't hear from them as much? Whereas, if they were a man, or if they were a different race, or if they were someone without a disability, we would probably, potentially, and the research shows, we would give them more opportunities. So I think organizations firstly need to understand that everybody has biases. Nobody is immune to biases, right? And I think we all need, I have lots of biases, but what I also do is I recognize, and I'm humble enough, I guess, to say, all right, I have these biases. What biases are there, and how can we make sure that we're pointing them out and working against them?
I think a follow-up question to that would be, how do you go about recognizing that you have a bias towards something or someone? Because so many people could probably go around not even realizing that they have these biases.
So one of my favorite stories to tell is, and I actually used this in my TED Talk. So there's a father and son driving along on a highway. They're driving along really fast. It's a Chevy. And they get into a terrible car accident. And the father dies on impact, right? And the son gets serious injuries and is rushed to hospital. And then the surgeon looks at the boy and is like, oh, well, I can't operate. Why? This boy is my son. And most people, when they hear that story, are like, oh, well, how can that work? Because I thought the father just died. Some people have said to me, clearly it's a gay couple. But actually what it is, it's the surgeon is the boy's mother. But the first thing that pops into your head, obviously, for most people, is that the surgeon is a man. And therefore, their assumption is that the surgeon is a man. So I think it's stories like this, but also there are tests that you can do online. So there's something called the implicit association test. So it's if you Google implicit association test, it's done by millions and millions of people, and there are lots of similar kind of tests that you can do online that can indicate to you what your biases are. But I think the basic assumption we should all go with is we all have biases, and what work we need to do as individuals is work out which biases affect us, and how can we mitigate them.
So my next question would be, what steps can an organization take to overcome unconscious bias?
I think firstly, starting the conversation about it is really, really important. And leaders within organizations need to make sure that they are leading that, right? And kind of saying this is something that we are committed to and that we actually value tackling. And it's not something that we're going to do for a little while and then kind of move on. We're actually interested in changing the way that we operate. I think then it's kind of not only about recognizing, but then understanding how it operates, right? And then finding ways to design processes in your organization to mitigate. So for example, one of the ways bias often occurs in hiring is that you look at a person's name. And in Australia, for example, the studies show that if you have a Chinese last name, you have to send out 68% more resumes to get the same number of callbacks. If you have a Middle Eastern last name, it's 64% more resumes. So if you were a white guy, you send out 100 resumes, you get 50 callbacks. Me, I would have to send out 164 to get 50 callbacks. It's wild. It's wild, yeah, but that's what the science shows. And so, one thing you could do as an organization is always not have the name, always not have a picture, always not have the age. So you're only looking at the person's CV, right? And there's also, a split between male and female applicants. The science shows. The other thing is, like in promotions, for example, make sure that you always say there are 3 people that you're considering for promotions, and no more than 2 can share the same demographic. So if you've got 3 people, no more than 2 can be men, no more than 2 can be black, no more than 2. And so it forces you to kind of like change the pool that you're looking at. And then I think also kind of recognize that people can operate in different ways. So what tends to happen is that men are promoted on potential and women are promoted on past experience, right? So a man may not have yet done something really impressive, but people are like, oh yes, I see potential in them. But they rarely do that for women. Women have had to prove themselves first. So challenge that when you're having discussions in an organization. Be like, can we see potential in this person? And if not, why not? Is it because of their gender? Is it because of their race? And really, be brave enough to question these things.
Those are excellent points. So what advice would you give to someone who's maybe struggling to, because you do discuss labels and biases as we've mentioned, what advice would you give to someone who struggles breaking through labels?
Yeah, firstly, I feel for you. Like it's tough. And I think what the world tends to do is the world likes to compartmentalize us, right? Because it's easy for us to sort of say, oh, you're a woman, therefore you are XYZ. Oh, you're, black, therefore you are XYZ. I think the way that I have dealt with it is try to get an understanding of who I am and not accept what others want me to be, if that makes sense. And so I think a lot of people would look at, someone who's a Muslim woman and think you must be, quiet or oppressed or whatever assumptions they come up with. And I choose to, I guess what I do try to do is not think about those things and sort of say, who do I want to be? And how can I define myself in the world? And not actually, because I think what I've realized is that if I allow myself to be controlled by those labels, I'm actually giving my control away. I'm like essentially giving a passport to someone else to be like, here is the remote control to my emotions. Go ahead and mess with it, right? And that takes time and that takes practice. And so I think it's also being generous with ourselves and saying, you know what, sometimes it is really tough when the world sees you a certain way. And all you want to do is sit at home and watch Netflix, and you can do that too. But at the end of the day, like you have the power. Actually, this is another piece. You have the power to control your mindset, right? So people might look at me and have assumptions about my gender, but the way that I think about it is I try to make it a positive. So I'm like, they're going to notice me because I'm the only female in this male-dominated industry. Sweet. I'm going to use that to my advantage, right? I'm going to make sure everybody knows me and everybody knows how great I am. Oh, everyone's staring at me in the street. I think it's because I'm hot. It's my secret Beyonce self-talk, right? Yeah.
I love it. Because also at the end of the day, like how you view yourself is so much more important than how other people view you. What's next for Yasmin?
Oh, that's $1 million question. So I've spent the last few years working on oil and gas rigs, but since about April this year, I've been sort of full-time speaking and writing, which has been pretty awesome, and broadcasting as well on television. So I'm writing another book that's on the DL. So that's, it's very, very exciting.
Exclusive.
And I'm also getting into some video content. So keep an eye out for that. Yeah, a few cool things happening.
Well, Yasmin, I want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me. We really appreciate you coming by. Everyone, be sure to visit Yasmin's page on eaglestalent.com, and thanks for joining us.